All right. Well, hopefully everyone is still awake and we're not getting into the post-lunch nap time. We'll try and keep this super exciting and keep you all awake and maybe put in some surprise remarks. So thank you for coming to this session. We are super excited. I think one of the things that might have taken some of you by surprise is that the name of this talk is A New World Disorder, and it's about navigating a polycrisis. But the gist of it, what's underneath this, is actually our Ipsos Global Trends study that was just released. So we've got some really exciting stuff to share with you, and certainly happy to talk to you afterwards as well. We are not related. I don't know. We get this question all the time before people see us, and we just happen to have the same last name, completely unrelated. Mercedes is based in Chicago. I'm based in New York. We just happen to work on the same team and happen to have the same title. So you'll hear from two benders today, and hopefully it'll be very exciting and engaging. But we are both part of the Ipsos Strategy 3 consultancy. So if you're familiar with Ipsos, one of the largest market research firms in the world, we're both based in the US but work with global clients. And Strategy 3 is really the consultancy within Ipsos that helps clients not just understand what research needs to be undertaken, but really consults with clients along the way and helps apply it to their business in a very actionable way. So we're very focused on all of those different areas, including innovation and trends, as we'll talk about today. So the areas of expertise, again, very high level, just a snapshot of what we do for reference. What we'll be spending the time talking about today is really our trends and foresight practice. But just know that Mercedes is actually the head of our DEI practice as well, and so she'll bring some of that to bear as we're talking about the trends today. So the name of the talk really is about a new world disorder. And what that means is that if you think back to the last 50 years, 100 years, even before that, we had the relative luxury, if you will, of thinking just about what is the current crisis at hand. So if you think back to World War I, World War II, even the crises that were happening in the US at that time, or even afterwards, it used to be that it was the Great Recession, and that's what everyone was worried about, or it was a war, or it was one issue. What we're seeing now, and I think, of course, we're all experiencing this, is it's not just one issue, it's not just one crisis happening at a time, but it's multiple crises. And the reason that this is important is because this concept of a polycrisis is what resonated with us. And what that really means, according to this definition, and it felt true to us as we were undertaking the trend study this year, is that it's really about the impact of multiple crises happening at the same time, influencing one another and potentially making situations worse. So that all feels kind of dark. But one of the things that we wanted to pull apart is to really look at, what is the context in which all of your brands are operating, all of your consumers are operating, to really understand the context and what's happening in the world around us that's going to impact behavior and going to impact what people need. So the first theme that came out of our study is really, an economic crisis hitting our wallets and hearts. We've been reading the news. We all know what's happening with the banking crisis even this week. So this is certainly something that's top of mind, especially in the US, that inflation and the cost of living crisis, the banking crisis, are all very much weighing heavily. So we saw a lot of that come out. We also saw this year a lot of the tension between global and local, so valuing global brands, but also being very mindful of the impact of our purchases and our actions on local communities and people. And we also saw, especially this year, a lot of themes come to the surface about the environment and really recognizing that it is an existential crisis that we need to figure out how to solve. So all of that really is yes, the context that we're operating in and part of the long-term forces that are happening, but there's a lot more happening in the world that we need to be aware of in terms of understanding what's influencing consumer behavior, what are the problems that we need to solve for, and what are the opportunities for brands and for companies. So it's as much about understanding that context as it is putting it within the broader context of things that are happening way above and beyond what's happening today in the news headlines. So what we have to share with you is just a quick snapshot of some of the really great tool set that's part of our Ipsos Global Trends study that just came out. And it's the biggest one that we've ever done within Ipsos, across 50 markets, almost 50,000 consumer interviews, and representing nearly just over 70% of the GDP. So biggest in scale that we've ever undertaken. And it's been a really great launch. We've been on this roadshow of kind of touring around, but what is really kind of special about this and probably different from other research companies is the Global Top Line Report is available to you and is an amazing resource. At Ipsos, we are intellectually generous, we like to say. And so this is an amazing toolkit that will give you kind of a whistle-stop tour of some examples, but it's a fantastic resource for you to take back and use within your own organizations. So we'll talk through a couple of macro forces and trends just to give you a sense of what's inside. So the macro forces really are things that are going to be impacting the world around us across a steep W framework. You may recognize some of these from other researchers. I think the idea of macro forces is not necessarily unique to Ipsos, but something that's really important for us as trends and futures practitioners to think about everything that's impacting the world around us and everything that's impacting consumers and citizens around the world. So these are all very much applicable to the US market as well as to other markets. They just vary a little bit in terms of what the impact is across different markets. So I'll give you a couple of examples today just to talk you through kind of what some of the examples of ways that you could use this. The first one that we thought was interesting is aging population. So if you think about the fact that the birth rate is below the replacement rate in most countries, really what that means is that we have aging populations, including in the US. So as you think about the implications for your business, how do you think about whether your products and services are meeting the needs of those aging consumers? If you're a CPG company, for example, do you have products that are easy to open for people with arthritis and limited mobility? Do you need to think about potentially redesigning products to meet the needs of those aging consumers? The next one was around toll of technology, and this is really about the tension between knowing that we need to be connected in order to go about our daily lives, connect with friends, do our work, go to school, but understanding that that's taking a human toll as well. So there's pushback already on, being always connected. We're seeing changes in behavior with Gen Z starting to pull away from social media and really taking a critical look at what the impact is on our mental health. So if you think about that through the lens of your business, through the lens of your brand, how do you reconcile the fact that consumers need to be connected, citizens need to be connected, and yet they're desiring to be disconnected and to be present in the real world? How can you solve for that tension is a really rich area to explore. And then the last example is entrenched inequality. We'll talk about this a little bit more today when I pass it off to Mercedes, but this is really about the growing understanding that there are systemic inequalities that are happening, not just in terms of gender, but certainly in terms of economic differences and racial and diverse differences, inequalities that we really need to grapple with as businesses, and to have an honest conversation about, if we come to terms with the fact that society is unfair, that there are these entrenched inequalities, how can you as a company make a big difference and really come to grips with that in order to address equality and equity, not just across social lines, but with all of your employees and everyone in the value chain all the way down to the consumer. So those are just a couple of quick examples of the macro forces, but as you can see, a big kind of wonderful toolkit that you can use to spark conversation within your own organization. So I'll pass it over to Mercedes.
Thank you, cousin. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the trends for 2023, and then we'll present 4 of those today. So just so you know, too, these are trends that we've been tracking for the past decade. They've been influenced by the macro forces that Jennifer just walked through. They also have some interconnection, too, and influence on one another. So the first one we're going to talk about is climate antagonism. So as we know, climate change has become a very visceral reality for us. Within the past year, we've seen more climate-related natural disasters than ever before in recorded history. And there's a lot of conversation about who's responsible and who should fix climate change. So there are a lot of driving forces behind it. But 72% of Americans feel like we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And that's a little bit less than the global citizen response of 80%. So there's a difference between regions, but what we see within the US is that there's a lot of consistency around this concern. No matter what your gender is, no matter your age, education, income, working status, marital status, it is a very high concern for all of us. And there are a lot of signs about a pushback, and we believe that this is largely tied to during COVID, when we were receiving all these mixed messages about the virus, about the vaccine, that caused a lot of distrust within science, and we're seeing that show up within citizens today. 55% of global citizens believe that even the scientists don't really know what they're talking about on environmental issues. So we see a lot of things taking place that's as far as climate change, some effects of that. So within Puerto Rico, we see that the beaches, there's erosion on the beaches, and we see that there are countries like Australia who are making huge innovations within sustainability. But what we see is that progress is not just going to be a governmental effort, it's going to require efforts on citizens, corporations. And so you have to ask yourself, what is your business doing to cooperate and solve for the climate crisis? The second one I'll get into is peak globalization. So the world is a little bit divided. There's this tension between global and local that we're seeing. So we really value globalization. There's a lot of advantages that is brought to us. We've had increased cross-cultural understanding as a result. We have increased accessibility to goods. However, we see these nationalism like prevailing at the governmental level, and there's these protectionist policies that are being enacted as well. And so there's a lot of driving forces around the peak globalization as well. And 45% of Americans say that globalization is good for me personally. And this is a bit of an uptick. Another thing that we saw during COVID, as we all know, it was a huge challenge to small businesses. We were super concerned about them. We wanted them to survive. We wanted them to thrive. And there was more of an emphasis on local businesses at that time. But as we've come out, we see people start to appreciate globalization and global brands a little bit more as well. Even more so than that, 66% of global citizens agree that globalization is good for my country. And there's a direct correlation between that sentiment and people who are in developing nations. So of the top 20 countries that are on this slide right here, 10 of them are from Asia, 6 of them are from Latin America, and 6 are from the Middle East and Africa. And then 70% prefer to buy products from their own country rather than products from abroad. So there's a challenge that organizations are experiencing too as they look at supply chain and trying to manage production costs. So there's this messaging that's being created, and we see this within the US especially. There's a lot of other elements. There's nationalism, there's patriotism, but there's this sense that our products are higher quality and better than other products from other countries, and we want to make sure that we support our neighbors, support our communities. And so the industry is still just trying to seek what's the right balance between global and local. Like we see just last week, India has revived its local cola brand to try to combat competition from Pepsi and Coke. We see Danone has this local first company initiative that they're taking forward. So we're seeing a lot of that. So it is imperative that we find this balance between global and local. And you have to ask, where does your organization sit along this global to local continuum, and can and should this positioning be flexed in some sort of way? All right, so I'm gonna pass it back to Jennifer.
So the next one that we'll talk about is reactions to uncertainty and inequality. And this touches on a little bit of the macro forces that we talked about earlier, but this trend is really about, I think, acknowledging that what we're all experiencing, the uncertainty when we read the news headlines, when we think about our own personal finances, our own career growth, our own families, all of the things that we're worried about are certainly part and parcel of the way that consumers are reacting, the way that citizens are reacting around the world, and certainly something that we're seeing here in the US. So it's a recognition not just that there is inequality and that we're grappling with this as a society, but that there are all of these uncertainties that are really causing a lot of collective anxiety and worry about the future. One of the things that we thought was really important here is that the impact of that, as Mercedes happened to mention in the previous trend, the impact is really that we're seeing a lot more protectionist policies, a lot more worry about protecting your own and protecting those close to home. And part of the way that that is manifesting is we saw Americans were actually a little bit more likely than the global average consumer to want a stronger leader in the current elected government. And so as people are starting to navigate this and trying to make sense of the world and dealing with uncertainty and anxiety, what they're doing essentially is looking for certainty and ways to be sure, ways to feel more secure wherever they can. In some cases, that means that, over half of the population is looking for a stronger leader. So part of what we're seeing is really actually a departure from the global trends here. And bear with me, I know this is small for those of you in the back of the room. But the important two that I want to call to your attention, and by the way, these are all available at our website, and there are cards on the chairs for you to download the full report. What we're looking at is that this anxiety and uncertainty in the US is not caused by the sentiment of the world changing too fast. So overall, that is very tied together when we look at the global nations as a whole. But in the US, it's not that the world is changing too fast. It's not the pace of change that's really driving people's uncertainty and anxiety. What is tied to that, we think is really interesting, is that Americans are more likely to say that there's divisiveness, that there is discord and a lack of alignment between values, which I think we've all seen in recent elections, have witnessed on social media. So it's something more about what's happening in our own nation that is really driving that uncertainty and kind of creating this negative feedback loop. As we've seen around the world, and I think we'll see how the next couple of elections play out here, but what we're seeing is that those kind of uncertainty is looking like it's having more of an impact on elected officials. So the example here is that in Costa Rica, for example, a more populist economist was elected rather than someone with experience in the government. So thinking about views toward leadership, not just within the government, but how can we grapple with this uncertainty and provide more certainty and more of a sure-footedness to our consumers by increasing trust in our brands, by making sure that we're transparent about our transactions as brands and companies and as researchers. So how can we really grapple with this uncertainty in ways that help people feel like they're being heard and that we're coming together rather than being divisive? The question I think that we want to leave you with on this one is, if helping people feel stable and valued helps them feel more certain, how can you take an idea like that into your own company? How can you deliver more consistency and help offset that sense of uncertainty from the world around us? The last one is last trend that we'll talk through today, and happy to answer questions. I think we'll have a little bit of time at the end. The last one is around the tech dimension. And so this one is really something that we've been tracking over time in terms of how attitudes toward technology are changing. And it's really about understanding that there are an awful lot of benefits to technology, and really the ability of technology to improve our lives is certainly something that we've seen over and over. But there is this kind of pushback, as we mentioned earlier. So potentially looking very closely at the impact of technology and what is the toll taking, as well as looking at data privacy and understanding what is the value that we're willing to exchange in relation to or in exchange for our private data being used. So there's a lot to unpack in this trend, but I think certainly relevant for any of us working in the industry. And what we're seeing is that roughly in line with the global average, that Americans can't live without the internet, and we see that this is certainly driven by things like just the pervasiveness of technology, how much we need it for our daily lives, but it's also impacted by things like increased automation and the immersive frontier, concerns about AI and how machine learning is impacting our lives, how algorithms are impacting our choices. So there's a lot underneath this to unpack. But what we thought was really interesting is sort of this dual way of looking at this trend. And on the one hand, we see that across different generations, it's fairly consistent that consumers think we fear that technological process is destroying our lives. So there's this really interesting kind of dual way of looking at technology that on the one hand, we can't live without the internet. We can't imagine doing our jobs now. We can't imagine our kids going to school. We can't imagine, being disconnected from everyone the way that we have been over the past few years. And so as we're looking at this, you have to think about what the consumer experience is like, what the human experience is like, even for employees or anyone in the value chain. What does that solution look like when you're a company who's trying to grapple with both sides of the coin, understanding that we need to be connected, but we're a little bit worried that it's going to ruin our lives? So as we think about the impact of this, a few examples that we thought were helpful to think through is really thinking about things like Kitchen Pal, I thought was a good example for the US here, in the sense that it's designed to look at your pantry and really help automate in a helpful way how to keep track of what's going on at home, even if you're not at home. So being able to digitize services like this so that it automatically tells you what you need to purchase and really kind of streamlines one of those tasks that we all have to deal with. How can we look for ways and look for inspiration from ways that are minimally invasive but are really helpful in terms of what you need to get done? And I think good inspiration for all of us is to think about, even if you're not a tech company, how does your brand take inspiration from solutions like this and innovate in terms of products and services in a way that's still mindful of people's concerns about technology and internal debate about what is the right amount of technology in what channels, in what ways. So the question we want to leave you with for this one is, if there's this tension, between what tech is good for, what it's not good for, where it should and shouldn't be in our lives, how can you as a brand or as a company, how can you help consumers really resolve that and provide a kind of solution for the desire to disconnect while still being connected? What does that solution along that tension point look like? And how is that potentially different depending on who you're talking to, what kind of a consumer, what time of day it is, what kind of needs they need to solve, even where they are in their life stages, really thinking critically about how technology infuses all of our products and services through the entire value chain and through the entire channel of where we're selling our products and where we're delivering our services. So a lot to unpack here, but hopefully starting to kind of whet your appetite in terms of the richness of each of the trends and the macro forces, to show you how some of these are interrelated and can really provide an amazing tool set to be able to spark conversations within your organizations, with your clients, internally inside of corporations. And then I'll pass it to Mercedes to talk a little bit about what else is available and how to use that within your organization.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here. So we talked a lot about change today, and I hope that you all have even walked away and seen within all of these polycrises what the opportunities, the respective opportunities for us are coming out of those. But we should expect a lot more change and disruption in the future. So these questions that we asked are very necessary because it helps give us that preparedness for the future. So there are a few ways in which you can use these Ipsos Global Trends. So again, as Jennifer mentioned, this is all made available to you. So please, look for this. There's the postcard where you can access the link. There's a top line report that gives all of these trends, all of the macro forces. There's a video that's presented, so even if you have any colleagues that couldn't make it today, they can also see this presentation and see the wider scope of trends that we didn't get a chance to present today. And there's also some sector-specific insights as well. And again, the ways to use them within your strategic planning, use them to identify white space opportunities for your brand, inspire your team. It's a good content for lunch and learns to share out too. And foresight scenario planning. Make sure your scenario planning is kept in mind thinking about some of these global forces. And reach out to us if you have any questions or want any additional details. We'll be here, we'll be around later, and we'll be here tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Questions?
So we're happy to answer questions. I think we have 5 minutes left. Yes, in front.
So having gone through all this, what surprised you most, and what gives you the most hope?
I will say for me personally, and I'm curious to hear what Mercedes' answer is, the consistency and the conviction around environmental crises. I think that was a big departure from what we've seen in the years past, and I know especially in the US, attitudes have severely changed, and I think for the better. So while that was surprising to see how much consistency there was across most countries and even within the US across age groups, income, education, all very consistent, that also gives me hope, because I think then understanding that we need to change our habits as people really starts to move the needle and to get that flywheel going in terms of like, we really do need to think about our individual actions and come to terms with collective actions, environmental policies at the government level, corporations, their decisions, and how we're manufacturing our products. So we're starting to move in the right direction in terms of, eliminating some things that we've should have addressed before. But I think that gives me hope for the future as well.
I'd say what surprised me most, and I don't know if it should surprise me the most, but just the impact that the pandemic has had. Like, that was, at this point, I know we're still kind of, we're coming out of it at this point, but just to see its impact on how we are as people, and we knew that would happen, but how that spills over into all these things that don't necessarily seem like they would have a connection, but just how they've changed our perspectives and the way that we think, and the influence that it has on some of these larger factors, and continues to and will continue to. So we're just changed forever. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is, of course, after knowing global trends, how the brands would adopt to it. Something like when you're saying people are being more aware about environment challenges that we are facing. Is sustainability the new? That's what you would tell the brands, that if that's the trend that you're seeing, that could be extended by your brands talking about sustainability helping the planet? Or how would you help the business with the global trends? Is what my question would be.
Yeah, you might have it. I have one answer, just in terms of like the ESG component, because I think what's important too, that brands don't often look at when they look at ESG, they look at the different components of it, and they pick the thing that they want to go for. And oftentimes it is the climate change, because that is the most pressing. That's the one that we can kind of wrap our minds around, and the one that we've been saying, like, we need to hurry up and make some changes for this, but not recognizing that there's overlap between ES and G. So it's not just about tackling one of those elements, it's seeing how the environmental element might affect different communities in different ways. So it's like coming up with a holistic approach for ESG is also really necessary if you're really going to like move the needle on it.
I would just add to that even beyond ESG, I think each person in here, each company who looks at this will need to curate what's relevant for my industry, what's relevant for my target market, what's relevant for the country that we're operating in, countries, regions. So I think looking at that not just as the ESG piece of it, but then thinking what realistically makes sense, what's going to impact my category and my business, and it's going to be different depending on your target markets, your target consumers, and the industry that you're in. So I think knowing that you may need to dial up or dial down your focus on different aspects of the trends. It's going to be a different answer for everyone, but hopefully this is, the starting point. And then of course we're happy to chat with anyone at the booth or afterwards or even tomorrow, or you have our contact information. So happy to help you along that process of curating what's going to be most impactful. Other questions? Stunned silence. Well, we've given you a lot to think about. We have 1 minute left. We're happy to answer more questions if you want to come up after the break, but hopefully this is a good introduction, and it's, again, an amazing, generous tool set from Ipsos to all of you. One last question, yes?
Was there anything in terms of Gen Z that was inconsistent with everybody else?
That is a good question. I think that we kind of glossed over a couple of them, but there are some areas where they scored much higher. They're much more concerned about certain trends, so we can answer those questions at the booth. We have all the data. All right, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time.